The palace of King Xerxes was a marvel of the ancient world, with its towering columns, golden walls, and intricate tapestries depicting the conquests of the Persian Empire. Haman walked confidently through the grand hall, his richly embroidered robe brushing against the polished marble floor. He was no ordinary man. He was second only to the king himself. The weight of power sat easily on his shoulders, or so he thought. Haman loved the way the servants bowed as he passed, their heads low, their voices hushed. To him, it was proof of his greatness, a reward for his ambition and cleverness. But there was one man, one infuriating man who refused to bow: Mordecai. Haman paused in the hall and turned to a servant. "Is Mordecai at the gates today?" he asked, his voice smooth but laced with irritation. The servant nodded. "Yes, my lord. He stands, as always." Haman clenched his jaw. "That man dares to defy me," he muttered. "Every time I see him standing there, it's as if he spits on my authority." The servant remained silent, wisely choosing not to respond. Haman waved him away, his thoughts churning with resentment. How could he, Haman, the king's most trusted advisor, be treated with such blatant disrespect? Mordecai wasn't just any man. He was a Jew, part of a people Haman considered beneath him. That evening, Haman hosted a lavish banquet for his family and friends. The table was laden with golden dishes, fine wine, and delicacies from across the empire. As the guests ate and laughed, Haman stood at the head of the table, basking in their admiration. "My position is unrivaled," he declared, raising his goblet. "The king has elevated me above all others. Every official in the empire answers to me." His wife Zeresh smiled proudly. "You are the most powerful man in Persia, my husband. Surely no one would dare oppose you." Haman's expression darkened. "There is one who does. Mordecai. That wretched Jew refuses to bow before me. It's as if he mocks everything I've achieved." The room fell silent for a moment before Zeresh leaned forward, her voice sharp. "Then do something about it, Haman. Build a gallows and hang him for all to see. Let everyone know what happens to those who defy you." Haman's eyes gleamed with malice. "A gallows," he repeated, savoring the idea. "Yes, I'll make an example of him. By morning, he will regret the day he ever crossed me." The next day, Haman ordered the construction of a massive gallows, 50 cubits high, in the center of the city. The sight of it filled him with a twisted satisfaction. He imagined Mordecai hanging there, his defiance silenced forever. But as the gallows rose, so too did the seeds of Haman's downfall, though he was too blinded by pride to see it. Later, Haman made his way to the palace. His plan was simple. He would request the king's permission to execute Mordecai. With his position and influence, he was confident the king would agree. As he entered the throne room, he rehearsed his speech in his mind, crafting every word to appeal to Xerxes' ego. But the king had other matters on his mind. "Haman," Xerxes called, his voice echoing through the hall. "Come closer. I have a question for you." Haman approached the throne, bowing low. "What does my king desire?" Xerxes leaned forward, a curious look on his face. "What should be done for the man the king delights to honor?" Haman's heart leapt. Who else could the king mean but him? Who else deserved such recognition? He smiled, his mind racing with possibilities. "For the man the king delights to honor," Haman began, his voice dripping with self-importance. "Let a royal robe be brought, one the king has worn. Let him ride the king's horse with a royal crest on its head, and let the highest official in the kingdom lead him through the city, proclaiming, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" Xerxes nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Excellent idea," he said. Go at once and do as you have said for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." The words hit Haman like a blow to the chest. His face paled and his mouth opened, but no sound came out. Mordecai? The king wanted to honor Mordecai? It was unthinkable, unbearable. "Is there a problem, Haman?" Xerxes asked, his tone casual. Haman forced a tight smile. "No, my king," he said through gritted teeth. "It shall be done." As Haman left the throne room, his mind swirled with rage and humiliation. He, the great Haman, would now be forced to honor the very man he despised. The thought made his blood boil, but there was no escaping the king's command. The morning sun rose over the city of Susa, casting its golden light on the towering palace and the bustling streets below. But for Haman, the day felt anything but bright. He stood near the king's stables, seething with anger as servants prepared the royal horse. Mordecai, the man he despised above all others, stood a few paces away, calm and composed. "Bring the robe," Haman barked at a servant, his voice sharp. The servant quickly handed him the royal garment, a rich cloak of deep purple adorned with golden threads. Haman turned toward Mordecai, his teeth clenched so tightly it hurt. "Put it on," he muttered, thrusting the robe toward Mordecai. Mordecai raised an eyebrow, but said nothing as he allowed Haman to drape the robe over his shoulders. There was no arrogance in Mordecai's demeanor, no smug smile, just a quiet dignity that made Haman's humiliation burn even hotter. As the servants brought forth the king's horse, Haman's temper simmered dangerously close to boiling over. The horse was a majestic creature, its coat shining like polished bronze in the morning light. A golden crest adorned its head, signifying the royal favor it bore. Haman took the reins and turned to Mordecai. "Get on!" he spat through gritted teeth. Mordecai complied without a word, gracefully mounting the horse. Haman's fists tightened around the reins as he led the horse into the streets of Susa, his head bowed in shame. The streets were already bustling with people, and as the procession began, a murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Haman, the king's most powerful advisor, was leading Mordecai, the Jew, through the city. The sight was so unexpected, so ironic, that many paused their work to watch. Haman's voice rang out, strained and bitter. "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor," he called, his words heavy with forced enthusiasm. Children pointed, merchants whispered, and villagers exchanged astonished glances. The great Haman, parading through the streets to honor the very man he sought to destroy. It was a sight none would soon forget. For Haman, each step felt like a lifetime. His pride, his carefully built image, his very identity. Everything was being stripped away in this public display. Yet, as much as he hated every moment, he couldn't disobey the king. The humiliation was absolute. Mordecai, on the other hand, remained composed, his eyes focused ahead. Though he did not gloat or revel in the moment, there was a quiet confidence about him, a peace that seemed to come from somewhere beyond himself. It only fueled Haman's rage further. By the time the procession ended, Haman's energy was drained. He returned to his home, slamming the door behind him. Zeresh, his wife, and a few friends gathered around, their expressions a mixture of confusion and concern. "What happened?" Zeresh asked, her voice sharp. "Why are you so distraught?" Haman sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "The king," he said bitterly, "ordered me to honor Mordecai. I was forced to lead him through the city, proclaiming his greatness for all to hear." Zeresh's face fell, and the room grew silent. One of the friends spoke hesitantly. "If Mordecai, the Jew, has begun to rise, and you are opposing him, you will not succeed. His people have a history of overcoming great odds." Haman glared at him, his temper flaring. "Do not speak to me of failure," he snapped. "I am second only to the king. Mordecai will not stand in my way for long." But deep down, Haman felt the first cracks in his confidence. His wife and friends exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that the tide was beginning to turn against him. As night fell, Haman's humiliation and rage boiled over into a renewed determination. He refused to believe that his position was at risk. He had the king's favor, after all. Tomorrow he would attend Queen Esther's second banquet, and there he would solidify his plans. Mordecai's defiance would not go unanswered. But as Haman plotted his next move, the wheels of justice were already turning. Events were aligning in ways he could not control, and his pride would soon lead him into the very trap he had set for others. The palace in Susa shimmered with opulence as the evening of Queen Esther's second banquet arrived. Every detail of the event spoke of grandeur: the golden goblets, the rich tapestries, and the fragrant aroma of delicacies filling the air. Haman, freshly dressed in his finest robes, strode into the banquet hall, his earlier humiliation at Mordecai's honor shoved to the back of his mind. Tonight, he was confident, assured that his position was secure, and eager to bask in the favor of both the king and queen. As he entered the chamber, he was greeted by King Xerxes himself. "Ah, Haman, tonight we dine as the closest of allies," the king proclaimed, clapping a hand on Haman's shoulder. Haman bowed deeply, his smile wide but calculated. "Your Majesty, your kindness knows no bounds," he said smoothly, his voice full of practiced charm. "It is my highest honor to be here." Queen Esther, standing gracefully at the head of the table, greeted them both with a serene smile. "My lords, please take your seats," she said, her voice as gentle as the soft music playing in the background. Haman's chest swelled with pride as he took his place beside the king. To be included in such an intimate setting with the queen was a privilege few could claim. He glanced at Esther, curious about her intentions, but confident that her favor toward him was genuine. After all, why else would she have invited him twice? As the meal progressed, the atmosphere grew more intimate. Esther poured wine for her guests, her demeanor calm but purposeful. Finally, King Xerxes set down his goblet and turned to her, his tone warm and indulgent. "Now, my queen," he said, "tell me your request. Whatever it is, it shall be granted to you, even up to half my kingdom." Haman's curiosity piqued. What could the queen possibly want? Surely it would be something grand, something worthy of her beauty and station. He leaned forward slightly, eager to hear her reply. Esther hesitated. Her hands clasped tightly in her lap, she took a deep breath, her eyes meeting the king's. "If I have found favor with you, your Majesty, and if it pleases you," she began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion, "grant me my life. This is my request, and spare my people. This is my petition." Haman froze, his goblet halfway to his lips. The air in the room seemed to thicken as Esther's words hung in the silence. The king's brow furrowed in confusion. "Your life?" he repeated. "Your people? What do you mean, Esther? Who would dare threaten you?" Esther's gaze shifted to Haman, her expression unyielding. "The enemy of my people," she said, her voice ringing with quiet resolve, "is this vile Haman." The room erupted in chaos. The king's face turned crimson with fury as he rose abruptly from his seat. Haman, now pale as the marble floors beneath him, stammered, his confidence shattered. Your Majesty, I... Haman struggled to find words, but none came. Xerxes stormed out of the room, his anger so intense he needed a moment to compose himself. Haman, now trembling, turned to Esther. He dropped to his knees, his voice desperate. "My queen, please!" he begged. "I did not know. I did not realize your people." Esther's eyes narrowed. "You did not care to know," she interrupted. "You sought only power, and in your pride, you condemned an innocent people." Haman's pleas fell on deaf ears. Moments later, the king returned, his fury unabated. His gaze landed on Haman, who was still on his knees, his hands clutching at Esther's robe in desperation. To Xerxes, it looked as though Haman was assaulting the queen. "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" Xerxes roared, his voice echoing through the hall. At the king's command, guards rushed in, seizing Haman and dragging him to his feet. Panic consumed Haman as he realized his fate was sealed. As he was being dragged away, one of the eunuchs spoke. "Your Majesty, Haman has built a gallows 50 cubits high, intended for Mordecai, the man who saved the king's life." The king's eyes blazed. "Then let Haman be hanged on it." Haman's screams echoed through the halls as he was taken away, his downfall as swift and dramatic as his rise to power. Back in the banquet hall, Esther sat silently, her hands trembling slightly as the weight of the moment settled over her. Xerxes turned to her, his expression softening. "Your courage has saved your people, Esther," he said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Your wisdom has uncovered treachery, and justice has been served." Esther nodded, her heart heavy with both relief and sorrow. She knew the battle wasn't entirely over, but for now, the first step toward salvation had been taken. The palace in Susa was unusually quiet in the hours following Haman's execution. The once boastful official now hung on the gallows he had built for Mordecai, a chilling symbol of the consequences of unchecked pride. But for Queen Esther and her people, the battle was far from over. The decree to annihilate the Jews still stood, sealed by the king's own ring. Persian law could not be revoked, and the shadow of doom loomed over the kingdom. In her chambers, Esther paced anxiously, her heart heavy with the weight of what still needed to be done. She thought of her people, mothers, fathers, children, all at risk because of one man's hatred. Mordecai had been summoned to the palace to meet with her, and she awaited his arrival with growing urgency. When Mordecai finally arrived, his face was both somber and resolute. "Haman is gone," he said, his voice steady. "But his decree remains. If nothing changes, our people will perish." Esther nodded, her expression grave. "I must go to the king again," she said. "Though he has shown me favor, I cannot assume he will grant my next request so easily." "You have already risked much," Mordecai said, his tone filled with admiration. "But you were placed in this position for a purpose, Esther. Your courage has already saved us once. Trust that God will guide you again." The following morning, Esther donned her royal robes once more and entered the throne room. The king looked up, his face softening when he saw her. He extended the golden scepter, and Esther stepped forward, bowing low. "What is your request, Queen Esther?" Xerxes asked. "What more can I do for you?" Esther's voice was steady, but her eyes glistened with emotion. "If it pleases the king," she began, "and if I have found favor in your sight, let another decree be written to protect my people. The first decree cannot be undone, but we must give the Jews the right to defend themselves." Xerxes leaned back on his throne, considering her words. Finally, he nodded. "It shall be done. Mordecai will write the decree, and I will seal it with my ring." Mordecai wasted no time. The new decree was sent throughout the empire, granting the Jews the right to assemble, defend themselves, and take up arms against those who sought to harm them. The atmosphere in Susa shifted as news of the decree spread. The Jews who had been mourning in sackcloth and ashes now stood tall with renewed hope and determination. Meanwhile, Esther worked to ensure that Haman's influence was completely erased. His wealth and properties were handed over to her, and she entrusted Mordecai with managing them. Mordecai's rise to power was swift, and he became second only to the king. Under his leadership, the Jewish community began to thrive once more, their faith in God's deliverance stronger than ever. As the day of reckoning approached, the tension in the kingdom reached its peak. The Jews prepared to defend themselves, gathering weapons and forming alliances. Mordecai stood as their leader, his faith unwavering. On the appointed day, the Jews successfully repelled their enemies. The victory was not without cost, but their survival was a testament to their unity, courage, and the unseen hand of God. Across the empire, the tide had turned, and the Jewish community celebrated their deliverance. In the aftermath, Mordecai and Esther established the Feast of Purim to commemorate their deliverance and honor God's faithfulness. The celebration became a time of joy, gratitude, and remembrance for generations to come. The empire of Persia began to settle in the days following the Jews' victory. Streets once marked by fear and despair were now filled with celebration. Homes that had echoed with weeping were filled with song. Across the vast territories of the empire, the Jewish people rejoiced in their survival, their faith in God reaffirmed. Mordecai, now a man of great influence, stood humbly in his new position. Though he wore the king's ring and carried the authority once held by Haman, Mordecai never forgot his roots. Every decision he made was guided by wisdom, justice, and an unshakable trust in God's hand in their deliverance. Queen Esther continued to reign with grace and wisdom. Her actions had not only saved her people, but also reshaped the perception of the Jewish community in Persia. Esther's courage was admired, and her name became a beacon of hope for many, both Jews and non-Jews alike. One afternoon, Esther and Mordecai met in the palace gardens. The air was filled with the sweet scent of blooming flowers, and the gentle rustle of leaves created a serene backdrop. They walked together, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. "Mordecai," Esther said, her voice soft but resolute. "Do you think our people truly understand the weight of what has happened? That it was God's hand that delivered us, not mere chance?" Mordecai nodded. "I believe they do, but it is up to us to ensure they remember. That is why Purim is so important. It is not just a celebration. It is a testament to God's faithfulness and a reminder of what happens when we trust Him even in the darkest times." The Feast of Purim, established by Mordecai and Esther, became a time of great joy and remembrance. Families gathered to recount the story of their deliverance, sharing meals, exchanging gifts, and giving to the poor. Children laughed and played, and the elders told stories of courage and faith, ensuring that the legacy of Esther and Mordecai would never be forgotten. Yet amidst the celebrations, there were quiet moments of reflection. The gallows that once symbolized Haman's arrogance and hatred now stood as a stark reminder of the dangers of pride and unchecked ambition. It was a symbol of justice, but also a cautionary tale of how far a man can fall when consumed by his own desires. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of Haman's downfall extended beyond the Jewish community. Many in the empire began to question the nature of power and the responsibility that came with it. Leaders and officials who once admired Haman's cunning now saw his end as a warning. Xerxes himself became more measured in his decisions, often seeking Mordecai's counsel to ensure fairness and wisdom in his decrees. One day, Mordecai stood before a gathering of Jewish leaders in Susa. The room was filled with men and women who had survived the darkest moments of the decree. As they listened, Mordecai spoke with humility and conviction. "We must never forget what has happened," he said. "Our deliverance was not by our strength, but by the hand of God. And we must live each day as a testament to His mercy and faithfulness. Let us honor Him not just in our celebrations, but in our actions, in the way we treat one another, and in how we stand for justice and truth." The room erupted in applause, and many nodded in agreement. Mordecai's words resonated deeply, planting seeds of hope and resolve in the hearts of those who heard them. As the years passed, the story of Esther and Mordecai became a cherished part of Jewish history. Their courage, faith, and unity inspired countless generations, reminding them that even in the face of overwhelming odds, God's providence never fails. And though Haman's name became a symbol of shame and pride, his story too served a purpose. It stood as a warning, a lesson in the dangers of letting ambition and hatred rule the heart. Years passed after the dramatic events in Susa, but the memory of what had transpired remained vivid in the hearts of the Jewish people. Mordecai, once dressed in sackcloth at the gates, now walked the palace halls with dignity as the second most powerful man in the empire. Despite his elevated position, Mordecai never allowed pride to take root in his heart. He saw his role not as a privilege, but as a responsibility, a sacred trust to protect the people God had delivered. One early morning, Mordecai sat in his office, surrounded by scrolls and letters. The weight of leadership was heavy, but his faith lightened the burden. A servant entered, bowing deeply. "My lord," the servant said, "a delegation of Jewish elders requests an audience with you. They come to express their gratitude." Mordecai smiled and set aside his quill. "Show them in." The elders entered, their faces lined with years but filled with gratitude. One stepped forward, his voice trembling slightly. "Mordecai, we owe you a debt we can never repay. Your wisdom and courage saved us all." Mordecai rose and placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "It was not I who saved us," he said humbly. "It was the hand of God. I was merely His servant, as we all must strive to be." The Jewish people had embraced the Feast of Purim with joy and reverence. The days of celebration were marked by feasting, the sharing of gifts, and generosity toward the poor. It became a time not only to remember their deliverance, but also to reflect on the power of faith and unity. In homes across the empire, parents told their children the story of Esther, Mordecai, and the downfall of Haman. In one such home, a mother sat with her young son by the fire. The boy's eyes were wide with curiosity as she recounted the tale. "And what happened to Haman, Mama?" the boy asked. The mother hesitated, her expression softening. "Haman was consumed by his pride," she said gently. "He let hatred blind him, and in the end, he faced the consequences of his actions. But remember, it was also a lesson for us to choose humility and kindness even when it's hard." Meanwhile, Queen Esther continued her role in the palace with grace and wisdom. She often reflected on the path her life had taken, from an orphan in Mordecai's care to a queen whose courage saved her people. One evening, she stood on her balcony, looking out over the city bathed in twilight. Mordecai joined her, his footsteps soft against the stone. "The city is peaceful tonight," he remarked. Esther nodded. "It's a peace I never take for granted. Do you think the people will remember Mordecai? Will they understand the sacrifices that were made? They will, Mordecai said firmly. That's why we tell the story. It's why we celebrate Purim. To forget would be to dishonor everything God has done for us. Esther smiled, her heart lightened by his words. And to think, she said softly, there was a time when I was too afraid to speak. Now I see that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to act despite it. In the broader kingdom, the story of Haman's fall and the Jews' deliverance served as a cautionary tale. Haman's rise and abrupt demise became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked ambition and pride. Officials and nobles who once admired Haman's cunning now regarded him as a warning of what could happen to those who let hatred rule their hearts. Even King Xerxes seemed to have grown wiser from the events. He often sought Mordecai's counsel, valuing his insight and integrity. Under their leadership, the kingdom experienced a period of relative peace, with a newfound respect for the Jewish community. One day, Mordecai stood before a gathering of Jewish leaders in the palace courtyard. The air was crisp, and the murmurs of the crowd quieted as he stepped forward to speak. Our deliverance was not by our strength, Mordecai began, his voice steady, but by the hand of God. We were saved because we chose faith over fear, unity over division, and humility over pride. Let us never forget what happened here, not for ourselves, but for the generations to come. The crowd erupted in applause, their hearts filled with resolve to honor the lessons of the past. The legacy of Esther and Mordecai endured long after their lifetimes. The Feast of Purim became more than a celebration. It was a reminder of faith, courage, and the enduring truth that God's providence is always at work. Though Haman's name faded into infamy, his story served a purpose. It became a stark warning of the dangers of arrogance and hatred. In the years that followed, parents continued to tell their children about the brave queen who risked her life to save her people and the faithful man who stood firm against injustice. The story of Esther and Mordecai remained a light in the darkness, a beacon of hope for those who faced challenges of their own. As the sun set over Susa one evening, Mordecai stood on a hill overlooking the city. He whispered a prayer of gratitude, not just for the deliverance they had experienced, but for the enduring lessons that would guide future generations. Justice had prevailed, faith had triumphed, and the story of Haman, Esther, and Mordecai would echo through history as a testament to the power of courage and humility.